Open conversation, the paradigm problem, psychoanalysis, economics, and culture. Namaste. Ever since Kuhn pronounced the concept of the paradigm, it has traveled across all areas of intellectual discourse, often turning the apple cart. Conversation today is centered around deployment of this concept in areas of psychoanalysis, economics, and culture. Guide in conversation is consultant Dr. Himanshu Redway. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So can we start with the concept of the paradigm?
Paradigm is a concept essentially of a framework. Human thinking does not happen in a vacuum. It happens within a framework. Take, for example, the scientific discourse after Newton and before Einstein. It would always happen within the framework of Newtonian physics. Take the discourse of astronomy before Galileo. It would happen within the framework of the Christian beliefs of astronomy in the Western civilization, of course.
Yes.
Often we don't know, but the fact is there's nothing like a philosophy free thinking. And whatever we think, it falls in some philosophical framework. The framework can be optimism, pessimism, hedonism, idealism, materialism, agnosticism, but it falls in some philosophical framework. It's very difficult to have a philosophy-free thinking. Now, this philosophical framework in which we are thinking is what is called the paradigm. So if you can visualize like a wooden frame, and inside the wooden frame, there is this space of discourse. And that discourse is happening inside the frame, not questioning the frame itself. And if you start at any point inside the frame, and you keep asking why, you will ultimately reach to the frame. For example, let us take a few examples to illustrate this. Take the example of take the example of a Newtonian time, or pre-Newtonian, let us say, where the concept of energy was not there. So the only thing that was known was matter and force. Or even before that, only matter. So everything that occupies space and has weight is matter. And there is only matter and void. Either. Now, if somebody was to say that something exists like electrical power, which does not have weight, does not occupy space, but can exist, can be manufactured, can be even traded, people would have called that person crazy. If DSM was to be written in those times, this would classify as psychosis. Right? Bizarre belief. Take another example of Newton versus Einstein. So the Newtonian framework is a framework of a static background. That for any object, the rest of the universe is a static background. Versus Einstein, where everything is relative and everything is flexible and contracting or expanding. So the analysis in the two frameworks is different. What is crazy in one framework is very normal in another framework. Take another example of singularism versus pluralism. So Hinduism is based upon pluralism. All the three Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all based upon singularism. And the belief of singularism is that there is one truth, there is one speaker of truth, there is one book of truth. And if you believe in anything else, it is my duty to bring you to the right path. And if you cannot come to the right path, I have all the rights, not only rights, it's a duty to destroy you. Because not only you are on the wrong path, you will spoil the world and take it on the wrong path. Whereas pluralism means there can be multiple ways, multiple truths, and I have the freedom to believe or not to believe, and if to believe, any way I wish to believe. So there is singularism versus pluralism, two paradigms. Within pluralism, you have Hinduism, Eastern religions. Within singularism, you have Christianity, Islam, Judaism, feminism, communism, capitalism. All the isms of the West are essentially outcomes of singularism, including modernity. Modernism or modernity itself is an outcome of singularism. Similarly, take another example of paradigms, Ayurveda versus allopathy. In allopathy, it is always the pathogen or one organ of focus which is dysfunctional. Whereas in Ayurveda, it's a systemic approach to everything. And it is a general system, the general metabolism which is at the root, not the pathogen, not a single organ. It is the whole system and the whole metabolism which manifests at a specific point as a specific problem. So the specific is not healed as a specific isolated problem. It is healed as arising from a general dysfunction of the metabolic system. So everything is systemic. Systemic, let me say, everything is systemic. So these are some of the examples of a paradigm. And you can also look at the capitalist systems, the present capitalist system, the economic system of the world. The paradigm is man is a rational being, man is individualistic, and man is hedonistic. Maximization of pleasure is the only goal, and it has to be done within a free and fair model. That's all there is to capitalism. So these are some of the ideas of what a framework is. Now the difficulty is this: the framework, the paradigm, the constituents of the framework are not scientific statements. Scientific statements are inside the space of the framework, in the discourse. The framework is constituted of beliefs and values, which are philosophical in nature. They are not scientific in nature. You can't prove or disprove them in laboratory. You can't prove or disprove them by a survey or any statistical study. Essentially, these are philosophical statements. These are beliefs, and they become the final justification for everything that is inside the system. So the beliefs and the values, or the axioms as we call it, the axioms which constitute the framework, they provide the final justification for everything that is inside, but they themselves don't have any scientific justification. They are philosophical beliefs. And Wittgenstein said something very interesting about it. He said, the justification of the most justified stands itself unjustified. That the axiomatic framework which provides justification to everything that is inside, it itself stands unjustified. So this is what a paradigm is. And paradigms exist in all areas of intellectual activity, all areas of human activity. So in economics, there is a paradigm, or there are multiple paradigms. In psychoanalysis, there are multiple paradigms. In medicine, there is a paradigm. In culture, there are multiple paradigms. In spirituality, there are multiple paradigms. So paradigms exist. When we say a school of psychoanalysis, Essentially, we are referring to a paradigm in psychoanalysis. So every school is one example of a paradigm in psychoanalysis. So there is a Freudian paradigm, a Kleinian paradigm, and so on. So within the larger paradigm of psychoanalysis, there are these small paradigms of schools. And therefore, it is very necessary to understand the concept of paradigm, the creation of paradigm, the difficulty of modifying an existing paradigm, and working within the paradigm, knowing that the ultimate logic of the paradigm itself is not infallible, because there is an alternate paradigm sitting next to us with a different ultimate logic for its axioms. So when we talk of psychoanalysis, economics, culture, it's very necessary to understand the concept of paradigm and the difficulty of a change in paradigm, and greatest difficulty of living in times where the old paradigm does not seem to be relevant anymore. A new paradigm is needed, but the shift is very difficult. Those are one of the most difficult times. So the concept of paradigm is very important to every discipline of knowledge and activity, and equally so for the three subjects we are focusing on today: psychoanalysis, economics, and culture.
So when we talk about this paradigm, we talk about the scientific or the philosophical concepts prevailing in certain time era. So technically, what are the intellectual problems related to this paradigm, fundamentally and otherwise in the transitionary phase?
Paradigm provides a foundation for intellectual discourse. Paradigm also becomes a limitation of intellectual discourse. And history of change in paradigms, if you look, is often a history of very violent struggles. You can think of struggle between capitalism and communism, between two paradigms, two philosophical ways of looking at the world, two philosophical ways of believing what is best for the greater general good of the world. So you can see how much violence there was in the clash of two paradigms, what we call the Cold War, between capitalism and communism. Similarly, you can see the transition from monarchy to democracy. Again, a blood-soaked, violent change. You can look at it as a struggle of annihilation between Hinduism and Islam, ongoing for 1,000 years. How violent, how bloody that is. You can see it as a clash between Judaism and Islam, equally violent. You can see it as a clash between the Nazi worldview and communism, how violent it was between Germany and Russia. So the only exception that we see where a paradigm can be changed peacefully used to be in India. Like in India, in spirituality and in culture, people would gather in large stadiums and the leading people would debate, and whoever wins, people would question, and if they were satisfied, large numbers of people would change from one philosophy to the other. And this would happen by means of debate, which no other civilization has ever seen. And the best example in recorded history of it is the iconic debate between Shankaracharya and Mundan Mishra. So when the entire Indian subcontinent had gone on the Buddhist path, Shankaracharya debated all of them in public, defeated, and large number of people converted back from Buddhism to classical Hinduism. Now, this kind of a civilized paradigmatic change, you don't see in any other civilization. So this was an exception, but otherwise it's very difficult. Paradigm, more often than not, becomes a problem rather than an asset to intellectual progress. In physics, there is a saying, if physics progresses funeral by funeral. Meaning, the oldies who have created a paradigm or are invested in it lifetime They are the ones who come in the way of letting go of the present paradigm and embracing a new one. And they control all the gates of knowledge creation. They are on the editorial boards of journals. They are heading the universities. They are the editorial board of conferences. They are the ones who decide on giving prizes. So they become gatekeepers of knowledge, and they favor one knowledge over other type of knowledge. So there is as much politics in the area of knowledge as much it is an area of knowledge. So this becomes very difficult, that to see the end of a paradigm, to see the need of a new paradigm. For that you need what Hegel used to call to see the present with the eyes of history. That if you can see the present not isolated as it is, but in the flow of history, linked to its past and linked to its probable future, when you have such a wide view, then you develop the wisdom to see the difficulties of the present paradigm, let it go if need be, and contribute to the creation and establishment of a new one. But this is a very difficult thing, to see the present with the eyes of history. And today, situation is so complicated. You have to see the present not only with the eyes of history, but also with eyes of psychoanalysis, also with the eyes of culture and spirituality. And when you need such a wide and deep perspective on such a large time scale, and in the context of which to look at the present, then it requires a very deep philosophical capability. You need a real philosopher, not just a professor of philosophy. You need a real philosopher. And unfortunately, in our times, we don't have such philosophers. A few years back, not few years back, many years back, I had come across a Time magazine titled, very interesting title. It said, "What has happened to leadership?" And this was around 92, 93, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the same is true today. What has happened to the philosophers? They are nowhere to be found. And the present leaders, none of whom is a philosopher. And in the philosophic community itself, you don't have the type of philosophers that I am referring to. Writing a book and winning an award in philosophy does not make you a philosopher. Rajneesh used to say that mystics, philosophers, and masters, they grow in the wild like wild plants. You can't cultivate them in a garden. So the formal system, whether it is educational, cultural, or social, can't cultivate these people. They will grow wild despite all structures, not because of them. This is where we are stuck today. The existing paradigms are no longer adequate, we know it. We don't have the courage to really express it and put it aside and create a new paradigm, which is even more difficult than just accepting the new for a new paradigm. And this is where the human civilization today is stuck.
That's a matter of concern.
We need clear analysis of why the present paradigms are not adequate. We know they are not adequate. We are not able to reason out why very clearly. Second, we don't know what a new paradigm should be, and we need some knowledge about how it should be. It may not be perfect to start with, but there has to be something good enough to start with. This calls for philosophers who are nowhere to be found as it is today.
Coming to specifics, can we take an example in psychoanalysis of crisis of this paradigm?
Psychoanalysis as a paradigm itself is an outcome of a larger paradigm called modernity. And psychoanalysis therefore shares with modernity some of the axioms. The axioms are, it is based upon individualism, it is based upon isolationism, it is based upon empiricism to some extent, it is based upon hedonism, and it is based upon atheism and agnosticism. And this creates difficulties because we know that all schools of psychoanalysis ultimately hit a dead end at some point of their journey. And they hit a dead end because of the axiomatic problems. And partly because the next step requires not only intellectual widening, but deeper spiritual experiences, both of which are difficult for the classical developers of psychoanalysis, even though they are masters of the schools. Some new developments actually tell us how the present paradigm is inadequate. And some of the discoveries of recent times which tell us the need to see the deficiencies of the present paradigm and create a new one. Some of them are like this. First, the discovery of intergenerational transmission of trauma. That is completely alien to psychoanalysis.
True.
Second, the contribution of culture and society to trauma, to psychopathology. Kohut had first talked about it. Lacan expanded it to bring in the big other. But despite those advances, that small widening, we still have not really incorporated the larger issues of culture and society into psychopathology. We have talked about it before, how Kohut used to say the type of patients he gets and the type of patients Freud used to get are very different. Freud's patients were essentially of desire frustration. He used to call them the guilty man, guilty of excess of desire. Whereas the patients Kohut himself used to get, he used to call them the tragic man, where the healthy self has not formed because of difficulties in mirroring or early life object losses. So before, the difficulty was of repression. Now, the difficulty is of fragility. Similarly, the ideas of the collective inheritance which Jung propagated, the idea of entanglement in quantum mechanics, that despite no physical link, information is transmitted faster than light in two elements which are entangled. And this has very profound implications for psychoanalysis.
True.
Do people transmit something which is of interest to psychoanalysis through these mechanisms? The whole area of parapsychology, the whole area of psychedelics. In psychedelics, people say it's almost like some of the psychedelic drugs ultimately will be like telescopes to astronomy. What telescope was to astronomy, some of the psychedelic drugs will be to psychology. That will be able to see deep inside what otherwise was not visible. The challenge which is coming from Hindu spirituality and the mystical schools of Hindu spirituality, in terms of model of the mind, in terms of healing. The whole idea of limitation of width and depth, that in width, we restrict ourselves to the individual and the family members. We don't go to society, politics, history, culture, the philosophical civilizational expanse. So there is a width problem in psychoanalysis, and there is a depth problem, that we stop at macro processing, we don't go into epistemology. So there is a depth problem. So there is a depth problem and there is a width problem. So in both ways, there is a range problem of inquiry. Then we have the holistic healing paradigm, which also is a challenge to the paradigm of psychoanalysis. Can we mix and match different schools? Can we mix and match East and West? Can we mix and match psychotherapy and spirituality? Then there is this whole area of energy healing, Reiki, pranic healing, acupressure, acupuncture, and so on, the martial arts. And then we have the tantric challenge of living beyond reflecting, where you live out, not just you talk and reflect and feel and let go, but you actually live out things which are very sticky, which are not getting healed despite so much of thinking and feeling. And then in order to look at these challenges, I have created a heat paradigm to really provide a new paradigm to psychotherapy. So these are the paradigmatic challenges. And you can see the difficulties also coming out of those paradigmatic challenges in the area of psychoanalysis. And I'm sure in the next 10 years, we will see very deep-rooted paradigmatic changes in psychoanalysis.
So secondly, to economics, how does the crisis of paradigm play out?
We have 3 minutes to go.
So we take up the next question in part 2.
Better.
Okay.